Hey everybody, what's going on? And welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a moment to thank all our new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down in my videos. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it, and I do try to read as many of them as I can, so guys, please keep them rolling. And thank you everybody who voted in my latest tab between which ship I should cover next. I've been paying attention to that as well. All right everybody, well hey, let's get into today's topic. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the long-standing myth that the Titanic's third-class passengers were locked deep inside the ship, and the ship's officers only let a small handful of them up to the boat deck throughout the sinking. I want to dive into this theory and find out if there's any truth to it, and try to figure out exactly what the situation was with the third-class passengers on the Titanic the night she sank. In order to better understand this whole question on if the third-class passengers were locked inside the Titanic during the sinking, we first need to answer the question of what it meant to be a third-class passenger on the Titanic. You see, Titanic was divided up into classes. You got first class, second class, third class, and based on which class you were in determined the amount of perks you got while you were on board the ship. Now, that sounds a lot like today, but in today's world, like take airplanes or cruise ships or whatever, let's take a cruise ship for example. The more money you pay for your crossing, the better room you get. However, that's the only difference. Everybody gets the exact same food, the exact same stuff. You know, there isn't a segregation on people based on what kind of room you have on the ship. Well, however, 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. Each class was divided up into their own sections. So first class had a section, second class had a section, and third class had a section. And it wasn't just the amount of money they paid that determined which section you were in, like in today's world. They had a variety of other factors as well. People in third class were often more likely to have diseases due to the living conditions that they faced at the time. So the whole idea was to try to keep each class separate in order to isolate people from these other levels of hazard. You got to remember, back then they didn't have the same medications we do today. Nowhere near the same quality of life standards, the basic stuff that we take for granted now. 100 years ago in the time of Titanic, it was a very, very different world. And you see, that brings up another point. A lot of people, when they talk about this topic, don't understand why that people treated the third-class passengers so badly. Well, to be honest, they were not treated badly at all. This is just how life was at the time. And people today make the mistake of putting our modern-day ideals and things that we take for granted on people who lived 100 years ago when the world was very different. So yes, today we might see how they treated the third class as bad, but to the people who were actually in third class, they thought they were being treated very well. They accepted their place in society and they did their best to try to strive to make more money and improve themselves. This is how life was to them at the time. So you have to remember that when you try to pass judgment or think about something that was going on 100 years ago. Now that you have a basic understanding of what first, second, and third class were like on the Titanic, you need to also understand the zones in which the third class passengers were allowed on the ship. So the first and second class passengers had access to the upper parts of the ship, the boat deck, around where the lifeboats are, and so on. However, the third class passengers were not allowed up on that part of the ship. Their primary zones were down here in the front area of the ship and towards the back of the ship. These were the two areas in which the third class passengers would primarily hang out on the ship. And in case you don't know, there were no lifeboats located in these sections of the Titanic. The lifeboats were located on the top of the ship on the main boat deck where the third class passengers were not allowed. So this is one area where this legend or story came from. The third class passengers were kept from the lifeboats. Another part of this legend came from these big gates that the crew on the Titanic used in order to keep the different classes separate. Now these gates were primarily used just to make sure that third class passengers didn't end up in the first or second class spaces, and the same for the first and second class. They didn't want them going down to third. These were meant just to keep the different classes from interacting with each other. Those gates are another big factor into adding fuel to the fire on this myth or legend, so to speak. That the third class passengers were kept behind these gates. The crew did not let them up, or they only let up small handfuls of them at a time, and kept a huge amount of people deep inside the ship while it was sinking. However, that does not seem to be the case. And another thing you have to remember, these gates were not everywhere. There were areas of the ship where the crew and third class passengers would meet each other that gave easy access to move from one section of the ship to the other and allowed easy bypass of these gates. It just depended on if you knew about the doorways or not. And you have to think on the night of the sinking that the crew would be using these very simple passageways and doorways in order to help the third class passengers get up to the boat deck and to get to where the lifeboats were. So what exactly do I mean when I say there was an easy way to bypass those gates and get up to the boat deck for third-class passengers? Well, this is a demo of Titanic Honor and Glory's video game, and I just left the third-class dining room, and I'm in a corridor now called Scotland Road. It was a passageway on the Titanic that both the third class and the Titanic's crew used to move throughout the ship. Now this space, up on the right, there's a door that is open, and this little basic door allows easy access for the crew and third-class passengers to get into the Titanic's first-class space and go all the way up to the grand staircase. So all they would have to do is go through that door, go up these stairs, and boom, you are up on the boat deck where the lifeboats are. So upon learning about all of this and about how there were ways to bypass the gates spread around the Titanic, it's like I said, the Titanic was carefully layered up and divided up into sections depending on which class you were. And it also depended on which class you were when you found out the situation and what was going on with the ship the night she was sinking. So in the beginning part of the sinking, you gotta remember the first and second class passengers were kept in the upper part of the ship, and third class passengers were generally kept in the lower parts of the ship. So that is one account as to why there were not that many third class passengers up on the boat deck not long after the initial iceberg impact and the beginning part of the evacuation, was because it was taking more time to get them mobilized because they were in the lower parts of the ship. So once they got them mobilized and things started taking place, the crew was doing their job to evacuate them successfully. So I did want to find out, though, if there were any true accounts as to the third class passengers actually being deliberately locked behind gates. So I turned to my favorite book, On a Sea of Glass. I'm telling you guys got to get this book. This book is amazing if you're interested in Titanic. But I turned to this book to figure out exactly if there were any stories of third-class passengers being deliberately locked below, so I could try to figure out how true they were. In the book, it does mention that there were some accounts of third-class passengers being stuck behind locked gates and not being able to open them. However, in the main common areas where the third-class passengers were primarily being mobilized and where they were actually being evacuated, it doesn't seem like there was that problem. According to the book, it looks like the whole incident of being stuck behind a locked gate was very few and far between. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, I'm just saying it was very, very uncommon. And it was most likely in areas where the evacuation wasn't really underway and they were gates that the crew simply forgot to unlock. So it doesn't seem like it was very common. But where the crew was actually mustering the passengers and moving them throughout the ship, it doesn't seem like that was the case at all. The crew was doing what they could to get the third-class passengers up on deck and get them evacuated. I think a big account for the loss of life on the Titanic and in the third-class population was the amount of time it took them to get up on the boat deck, because you got to remember the Titanic had only enough lifeboats for less than half of the people on board. So by the time a lot of the third-class passengers got up to the boat deck, most of the lifeboats were most likely gone. So I think that's more of an account to the great loss of life in third class, was not so much that they were stuck or locked inside the ship. It was the amount of time it took them to get mobilized and get up to the boat deck where the lifeboats were. My personal opinion as to why so many of third-class passengers passed away on the Titanic is, like I said earlier, due to the fact that it took them so long to get up to the boat deck, but number two is the fact that they did not know how to get up to the boat deck. It's like I said earlier, where the Titanic was heavily laid out in its class system, most of the third-class passengers remained in the sections they were familiar with. They didn't wander off and try to explore unknown areas of the ship in order to find their way up to the boat deck. So that road or that passageway on Scotland Road that I showed you earlier into first class, if the crew did not show the third-class passengers that doorway, there is no way they would have went through there and just gambled on it taking them up to the boat deck. Most of the third-class passengers stuck to the areas they knew. There are several accounts by survivors that most of third class went through Scotland Road and converged on the back of the ship in their designated deck area, because that is areas that they were familiar with. For a third-class passenger, going to Titanic's stern or the back of the ship makes a lot of sense. It's a quick way to get to an open part of the ship where you're outside, and if the Titanic is sinking from the front and going down like this and the stern is rising up, sure, go to the stern because it's the furthest point away from the water. It'll give you the most amount of time before the ship sinks. However, that wasn't the best move. You see, like I said earlier, there were no lifeboats in this zone, and due to the Titanic's class structure, it wasn't very easy to get from this part of the ship up to the top part of the ship where the lifeboats were. You see, they had a few stairways that could go from like this lower section up to this part, but there were no direct stairways to go from this section up to the higher section of Titanic. You see, the only access ways that they had to directly go from one section to the other were a series of ladders meant for one or two people at a time, not for huge crowds of people. And again, this is due to Titanic's class structure. So going to Titanic's stern and just trying to get a lifeboat from there was a pretty bad mistake, in my opinion, because you had next to no chance to get up to the boat deck. Taking another look at the sinking animation from Titanic Honor and Glory, you can get a better understanding of exactly what third-class passengers on Titanic's stern would have been facing throughout the sinking. As you can see, they don't have a real direct, easy way to get up to the boat deck where the lifeboats are. Now, it's also true that the crew had their own stairways and passageways to get from Titanic's stern up to the boat deck, but if no one told the third-class passengers about them, how would they know about them? The only thing that they knew how to do was to stand in their zones and wait for someone to tell them what to do or how to do it, and if no one ever did tell them, then they would just stay in their designated zone and not go anywhere. So in conclusion, I do not think that the reason the third-class passengers had a higher mortality rate than the other passengers on Titanic had anything to do with them being locked deep inside the ship. I think the crew was doing the best job that they could, trying to get them mustered and get them to understand what was going on. And you gotta remember, they were deeper inside the ship, like way down in the deeper parts of the ship than the first and second class passengers were. So I think it was more a situation of location. They didn't understand what was going on. Don't forget, a lot of the third-class passengers didn't speak English, so the crew was trying to deal with that. And if any of the third-class passengers were trying to figure out how to get up to the boat deck, they were trying to wander through these passageways they didn't understand and they didn't know. So they're stuck navigating a ship that is sinking. I mean, there was a multitude of reasons as to why the third-class passengers did not make it up to the boat deck until much later in the sinking. And then by the time they did figure it out and get up there, there's a good chance there were no more lifeboats. So, in conclusion, I do not think that the third-class passengers were trapped inside the ship. It seems any instances of locked gates and third-class passengers being kept far below, while possible in some instances, was not very common, and the cases were very few and far between. Anyway guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you were able to learn something and found it fun and insightful and got something out of it. I have a ton of fun making these, and I also have a ton of fun reading the comments, and any video topics, any ideas y'all want me to cover, please leave the comments below. I do my best to read as many of them as I can. Everybody else, please hit that subscribe button, and if you guys don't mind, please also give my video a like. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And to everyone who is new here, thank you. I really, really appreciate it as well. All right, everybody, y'all have a good day out there. I'll see you in the next one.